Coming up, how a rural grassroots sobriety movement brings people together to share their stories of hope and change.
Visions are powerful because they can move mountains when nothing else will.
For the first time in more than 30 years, this statewide gathering will take place in Alaska's biggest village.
It's exciting and a little bit terrifying.
The Rural Providers Conference, spreading the light on the road to recovery.
Alaska, where there are old triumphs, but also new frontiers, with challenges as great as the state itself, but a belief that the best is yet to come, bringing you the faces, the places, and the spirit of the last frontier. This is Frontiers with Rhonda McBride.
Welcome to Frontiers. While state and federal programs come and go, a grassroots Alaska Native sobriety movement continues to work its way from community to community. It's been a journey that spanned more than 3 decades, with many important milestones along the way. The Rural Providers Conference is held every summer. 1 week dedicated to one cause.
We are a community of people in recovery. We come from all different parts of the state.
Every 2 years, the Rural Providers Conference travels to a new community.
There are what they call 4 foundation principles.
Organizers say it's more than a conference, but a gathering of hearts and minds.
Visions are powerful because they can move mountains when nothing else will.
The Rural Providers Conference began 36 years ago.
It brings me great joy.
Some, like Doug Modig, return almost every year to rededicate themselves to the Native sobriety movement. Others are here for the first time, in search of sobriety, some for themselves, others for family and friends.
We don't have any experts around. All we have is each other, just another Native, and Native to Native, that we can help each other.
This group in Tanacross was asked to picture the town drunk and then imagine that person sober.
And I have a few people like that in my life, and I would never have believed that they could get sober. They were just so pitiful and so beat down, I could not believe that they'd ever get sober. And then one day, they talked about their recovery.
Whether in Tanacross or Nome, every gathering has some of the same rituals drawn from Native traditions from across Alaska. People also share their stories that are hard to hear.
That's what I did. I steal and I lie. I'll do anything. I'll cheat. I'll do anything to get a can of beer. And I said to myself, if I keep on drinking, I'm going to disappear. I'm going to be gone. January 15, 1992, my last drop of Budweiser.
Many of the stories have common themes.
Dad was busy drinking. Mom was trying to figure out how to get him to quit drinking.
Charley Holmberg has been a longtime leader in the Rural Providers Conference. She believes childhood and historical trauma is all too often the root cause of addiction for Alaska Natives.
What happened to me as a small child was I was sexually abused by several men in the community that I was from at a young age, from age 2.5 to age 4. And of course, children do not have the vocabulary to say what happened to them. And so I carried that abuse all of my life until I was age 35, and that is when I got clean and sober.
Some of these same conversations will come to Anchorage this July, conversations that organizers of the conference say are necessary for recovery.
We try throughout our agenda and our workshops to make this a really safe place for people to be able to open up with one another, because we know that processing past experiences as part of healing. And so we just try to open up those opportunities as much as possible.
Circle talks provide an opportunity for people to react and process and share their own stories in a personal way. Plus there's an open mic opportunity at the end of the day. So people who have been experiencing certain emotions or ideas or perspectives they feel like they want to share.
Ready?
It's also important, organizers say, to celebrate the strengths of Native culture.
Where's the love in it? It's right here. It's right in front of you.
Whether it's a bowl of moose stew or traditions that keep families healthy and happy. But when it comes down to it, no matter where the Rural Providers Conference takes place, it's also about the joys of sobriety. And that is what keeps people coming back year after year. The Rural Providers Conference has a budget of only about $25,000 a year, and a steering committee of volunteers does most of the work. Agencies and the host communities also donate space for the conference, as well as food and supplies. Well, joining us next, Amy and Doug Modig, here to explain that why dollar for dollar, this money is well spent. Even though this year's Rural Providers Conference is in Anchorage as opposed to a small rural community, space is still limited, so they want to preserve that intimate person-to-person nature of the gathering. It will be held at the Alaska Pacific University campus during the second week of July from the 8th to the 12th, and there are some dorm rooms available at APU, but you got to register to be able to get a space for this. Well, it's hard to believe that the Rural Providers Conference is in its 36th year, and although it has quite a track record, it has operated mostly under the radar. A lot of people still don't know about it, and joining us to tell us the story behind this gathering, Doug and Amy Modig. Every year you put a lot of work into bringing people to this gathering, but it isn't really something that if you ask most people about, they'd know what the Rural Providers Conference is. Why has it kind of stayed low-key?
Well, mostly we don't want people to get distracted off onto other issues. This is about helping people help themselves, mostly villages and village people helping within their own community. And nobody really wants their stories out in the open in the recovery process, especially in early recovery. So we don't, and we don't advertise. We're pretty much person to person, native to native.
So, Amy, who should come to Rural Providers Conference?
We try to target the people who want sobriety in their lives, and some people will bring their relatives, and to be inspired and to feel, part of this positive movement that's been going on for so many years. And
well, we have some photographs that show the two of you back in the day, because you've been with this movement for a long time, since the very beginning. What was the impetus for this, to get something different started, a grassroots sobriety movement?
So when we first started, the question was, what can we do to help ourselves? Or what can we do to address the alcoholism and the growing suicides that were occurring in our villages? And so what we happened to be in a place where we could address a statewide problem. And we says, well, we'll use traditional native thought in order to move this ahead. And so rather than develop a program to serve Alaska Natives, we developed a program where Alaska Natives could serve themselves or help themselves.
And every year it moves to a different, or every 2 years it moves to a different community. Why did you structure it that way?
Well, we listen real closely to what people say to us, right? And one of the things that they said is that we want this all over. We want this all over the state.
And look at all the communities over the years that this conference has touched.
They actually invited us to each in every community to work with them and to share the things that we'd learned along the way to help create sobriety and help people help themselves.
Well, one example I can think of is 2 years ago in Tanacross, you invited the community of Northway to talk about how they're dealing with meth. What's the value of that, of having people kind of talk about what they're doing?
Well, they had a real life problem, right? And the problem was that meth dealers were coming into the community and basically creating a market there. And what the community did was they says, we have a meth problem. What are we going to do to address the issue? And so what they did was they began to conduct village patrols within their community, all volunteer. And because they communicated with each other, because they worked together, it created a certain amount of respect for each other in their ability to work together. But also, I think it was very effective. But more, what they generated was hope, because they could help themselves. By doing that, they helped themselves create recovery within their own community.
You know, a lot of the Rural Providers Conference is talking, sharing stories. And why is it that that is the chosen medium for this process? Storytelling.
Well, if you think about the traditional Native thought, it really isn't about talking. It's about listening. Because when people tell their story and somebody hears their story, healing occurs. I mean, people talk all the time, but most of the time, nobody's listening. And so within the Rural Providers Conference, we operate out of a traditional way of thinking, and so that we have an audience of tens, maybe hundreds, that are actually listening to what they have to say. And in being heard, healing occurs.
So, Amy, this year there's a steering committee, which you and Doug are a part of, and they've invited some keynote speakers. These are also incredible stories from the keynotes. Who's coming this year?
We have the young woman, Elsie Boudreau, who will be telling her story of recovering, from a really tough background and having a life of service that is a very big inspirational one for all of Alaska. And then we have Tisha Simmons, who is from Fairbanks, and she's got another story that is just so inspiring. And Amelia Simeonov is a healer, a traditional healer. And she's part of the younger generation, and she'll inspire, people to try this path, and that's what we're hoping. And that's what we've always hoped for with the keynote people to
And usually they've been through big ordeals. You've been a keynote.
Doug, yeah.
And what did you talk to people about? What did you use that spotlight for?
Yeah, I talked about my background, as a child experiencing, violence and hunger, and then, the process that I used to get back and to find my own sobriety on June 23rd, 1983. But I used some of my own stories, my traditional stories to share my perspective and what happened. And it is healing to be able to tell that story and then to have people listen to that and say, I went through that, now I can, do something. And it makes sense out of the trauma that you've experienced that perhaps it can help heal others when you learn from what.
So there's the stories and the ceremonies, and we're going to talk about those ceremonies when we come back. Doug and Amy Modig staying with us. Well, ahead, how mindfulness and recovery go hand in hand.
This is an ancient family song.
The story behind these wooden stakes that symbolize so much for those in the search for sobriety. One one of the building blocks of the Rural Providers Conference, Rituals of Recovery. Amy and Doug Modig are back with us to talk about the importance of these rituals. You know, we're familiar with Alcoholics Anonymous rituals, sort of the classic, hi, I'm John, I'm an alcoholic.
Hi, John.
I'm John. You know them too. So what's different about the rituals for the Rural Providers Conference?
Well, the rituals help us to remember things, right? But the elders told us to solemnize what we do and how we do it, mostly with ceremony. So most of the rituals that take place by ceremony.
Well, there's one that's coming up this year that sounds very interesting, a blanket ceremony. What's that all about? Is that new to rural providers?
Well, it's a way to help people understand historical trauma and understand that even though we're singly called Alaska Natives, there are actually several different regions around the state, all of which has had a different experience of the extraction workers coming to Alaska, including the first
Talking
seal.
about mining,
Yeah,
oil,
mining.
fishing.
Yep.
So how does the blanket ceremony sort of explore that, demonstrate that?
Well, it graphically illustrates that, and part of it is that you have to be there, but the other part of it is that people symbolically create a map of Alaska, and then they graphically illustrate how many people died because of disease, how people died because of the extraction workers in Aleutians.
So in other words, they disappear from the blanket, is that?
Symbolically, yes, they do.
So that could be something very powerful, very, very hard-hitting there. But one of the ones that happens almost every time at a Rural Providers Conference is something known as the staking ceremony, where these stakes are driven into a pot of local soil, wherever that conference takes place. What's the story behind this? Why do you do this?
Well, one of our elders from the lower 48, actually Lionel Kanua, he brought a story from us from the Mandan people. And you know, I remember the story, but sometimes I remember it wrong or different, right? But basically it goes like this. They, back in the day, it used to be honorable to go steal horses. And so these young warriors, to-be warriors, ran off to go steal horses. And they got to the stealing the horses part down pretty good, but they weren't going to get away. You know, of course, when somebody steals from you, you want to immediately let them know that, no, you shouldn't be doing that. And so they chased them. And it was pretty clear that they were going to get caught. But one of the warriors jumped off of his horse, and he had a lance. This is symbolically a lance. And one end was tied like on the end of the lance. The other end was tied to his ankle. And so basically what he did was stake himself down. And what he was saying was that, I'm not afraid of you. You know, you might think that you can cause me to lose courage or lose commitment to my people, to my family, to my relatives that are actually running away to get back to their homelands. But do your best, do your worst.
So during these Rural Providers Conferences, people are making these stakes. Mm-hmm. And you brought some, as the official stakeholders, you carry the stakes from past conferences. Amy, can you explain how these stakes are made? They all look similar, but there are varieties on a theme.
Yeah, and they were like the symbol of unity. You know, the yellow, these are the different directions, and then the relative, the different races of the world. And then Seward was the Homeward Bound people made this for the Seward Conference, you know, and they added these little beads, you know, in the yarn. And then in Kotzebue, they didn't want a symbol of weaponry, so they gathered driftwood from the beaches of Kotzebue. And so they tied these little bits of yarn with them, and you have your own there too. And then in Nome, we had the people in the jail do these small ones, because they didn't want a real big one at the conference, they just wanted a little one. And so they had these little tiny ones, you know. And then we sat with the prisoners out there.
So what happens with these steaks? You make them, what happens?
Basically, we symbolize in ceremony the commitment to each other and to the people that follow us in recovery. And that, you know, when Amy and I began, we actually staked ourselves down to help other people in recovery. And we've been doing this since 1983.
What is it about the steaks and owning one that somehow strengthens your commitment? I mean, it's just a stick when it comes down to it.
Mm-hmm. It's just a reminder, you know, the people, and for some, it's very, very moving. You know, it is all personal. When they take one up, it is all personal, because everyone has a different story.
So, Amy, what is your favorite steak in this collection? Do you have a favorite?
I love the one from Nome because it's so tiny, you know, it can fit in my purse. I can take it with me wherever I go. But I also think, you know, like the duct tape was just so creative and so, you know, that people were doing this. But I love it when the young people are doing it because they're told the story, like you saw Charley out there talking about how to make a steak, you know, and they know that it's going to go to a person who will commit themselves to sobriety for health, you know, and it's for all of Alaska. And the young people get really into that, you know, knowing that someone is going to take this up and it'll be personal. You know, no sloppy, no letting the paint run, you know, and it has a lot of meaning. And I know people drive around it with their cars, you know, and when we go around, hey, I still have my steak, you know. But that's what the most exciting part about the rural providers is that somewhere down the line, we're going to have someone tell us, we got sober at the 2019 RPC.
And that happens a lot?
It happens a lot, yeah. 1987, it's 1992, whatever year it was.
And maybe the steak was the start of it.
Could be. We don't really know.
Yeah.
Well, we're just about out of time, but people that go to this conference talk about relationships. That may be one of the most important things that comes out of this gathering is this sort of family of sobriety that they find.
Well, at least what we have in common rather than what separates us. And it's an ennobling thing to be a part of a process that creates recovery in communities.
Well, I want to thank both of you, Doug and Amy Modig, the official stakeholders. They carry the stakes to remind people. Thanks for joining us. And, you know, before we go, you know, there may be some of you who've been watching who want to mark your calendar. So let me recap. The Rural Providers Conference is going to be held from July 8th to 12th. It is in Anchorage for the first time in 36 years at the Alaska Pacific University. To register, go to Rural Cap's website, ruralcap.com. And we want to thank you for joining us. We'll see you next week. But before we go, we want to leave you with dancing from the 2015 Rural Providers Conference in Nome. Enjoy.